What is your name?
George.
So how the hell did you end up here?
My mom sent me away.
She did it to keep you safe.
Your son did not arrive at his destination.
You're responsible for his safety. Why can't you tell me? Where's my boy?
This is for all the parents whose children have been evacuated, and for my boy, George.
Make a wish. One wish.
Hi, good afternoon, Carolyn for Carolyn Talks YouTube and podcast channel. So my question is going to be both for both you, Steve and Elliot. So the Blitz was a very physically traumatic time for England during World War II, but it was also an emotionally traumatic time for a lot of people in England because if I remember correctly, like over 1 million people were displaced. And during that process, like we saw in the film, like children like Elliot were placed on trains to go as far as possible. And the only thing they had to ID themselves were these name tags. And that was done not only in England, but all across Europe because it happened with the people that were fleeing Eastern Germany at that time. And I want to ask you both, for you, Elliot, can you talk about playing a character like George, where he's not only fearing for his life during a war, but he's also fearing that he'd never see his mother, as well as having to deal with the bigotry and racism as a child, because that is a very big part of the film as well, where it shows that as a child, George is facing all of these external forces, all this violence. He has the war, he's missing his mother, but he's also facing bigotry from both adults and children. So Elliot, I want you to talk about your process in dealing with that as a child actor. And for you, Stephen, this is your second project where you had to direct children. So your first project where you directed children was Education in the Small Act series. So can you talk about the differences in directing children in education, but as well for this, because this one, like you're dealing with such a bigger scale of a production, and you have one single lead young actor in this film. So Elliot, I'll have you go first.
So I think it's easy to say that it wasn't easy at first, but thanks to my acting coach, I was able to embody the character.
Simon, yeah.
Yeah, it took a while, but he taught me some tricks, and then eventually, for a while, I was George, and Elliot was at the back of my mind. I was George now.
And how did you how were you able on set to deal with all of the issues that came with playing a character like George? Because this is your first major production. You were found during an open casting call, so you weren't even necessarily like auditioning for a role like this, but this is the role that you found. So what was it like for you playing such a difficult character in facing such difficult circumstances? Because we don't normally get young actors playing these kind of characters very often.
Yeah, so I'd never acted before. It was my first audition, so it was new. It was definitely a new experience. It was thrilling, and yeah, I was asked to do a lot, but I think in the end, thanks to Steve and everyone on set, I was able to push through and eventually play George.
You did more than that. You were superb. I think he's even modest as a child. But what Elliot did was nothing more than miraculous, because there's a stillness in this young gentleman. And with that, the audience projects himself onto him. You know, you become George. So you revert back to who you were, this innocence. And again, it's like seeing everything for the first time. You know, it's like when you have a child and the child gives you a leaf, you know, and you look at this leaf, but then you actually look at it again because you're looking at it through his or her eyes. And that's what we do. That's what George helps us to do, trying to find our way back from the madness that we have curated, really.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
So I want to ask you a question about the technicalities of a film like this. So I've watched many World War II era films and TV shows, both BBC productions, PBS productions, Hollywood, what have you. And I'm always struck by the visual landscaping of Europe and of England at that time. You know, there's a very particular look and a very particular feel. And a lot of it has to do with the smog and like, as well as the clothing, the cover of the clothing. I want to ask you about your background as a painter, because you started out as a painter, as a visual artist, and then you transferred into filmmaking. I want to ask you about building the visual landscape of this film, especially with your production designer, Adam Stockhausen, who you worked with before on 12 Years a Slave, you know, on Small Axe and your other projects, as well as the new cinematographer is Yannick Lasso, who I believe this is the first time you've worked with him, and the sound landscape with Hans Zimmer. Can you just talk about building the visual and the soundscape of this film? Because you have a very particular eye. Like, honestly, like Widows, the cinematography in Widows is amazing. And I just love what you do with a film like this, because you have to make sure that you have to set it apart from other films set within that era.
Well, you know, I think I'm more interested in real life than I am actually in films. It's definitely more interesting. It definitely is more generous. So I started off in my head. I started off with a living room. It's a very small living room. It's a front room and back room. You know, it's very tiny. You know, the geography of that house where George and Rita and Gerald, his grandfather, lived, with the upright piano. And I kind of circle out of that. So, you know, from there we go to the subway, you know, which is this sort of underground sort of you know, cavern, as it were. You know, again, and it's deemed as the safest place to be during the Blitz. So, and then it's almost like from this small thing, you wheeled out, and you go wider and broader and bigger, because don't forget what's interesting about George is he's never really left his neighborhood. And he's going to Central London before, and he's seeing things that he's never seen before, because most of the time when people were living in the area, that sort of, you know, 2 or 3 mile circumference was all that they sort of knew. So that was the first thing, of how you sort of wheeled out from there, you know, and go bigger and bigger. You know, again, it's like the Wizard of Oz. You know, this little farm town going into this Technicolor. You know, Technicolor for us is the landscape, you know, of the Blitz when it's bombed out and so forth and whatnot, when it's bigger and bigger. And that's the only way you can, because I knew that the landscape was an epic landscape. I mean, making a British epic is usually a colonial epic. It's usually passage to India or out of Africa. You know what I mean? So to do it in the UK, you had to think about that. And I worked with Adam Stockhausen on that, and to get these real locations. And then with the soundscape, it was like working with my sound team. It was James and Paul, who were just extraordinary in how they were sort of feeling the space. And again, the bombs and how they landed. And again, with the sound, you get the sort of distance of space. And again, I'm going on. I could go on all day about this. But just one more thing is Jacqueline Duran and the costumes, to get the feel and the texture and the clothing. So the palette, and working with Yorick, my cinematographer, you know, I was very much into the frames, and he was into lighting, of getting it right. And again, there's certain texture which is there with the smog, you know, industrial revolution, the dust of the explosion, and this whole sort of atmosphere. It's alive. So again, there's a lot to talk about as far as visualization of that particular period, because, you know, even the sort of air has to be colored.